The air inside the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries design room in Nagoya was thick with the smoke of cheap cigarettes and the weight of an impossible demand. It was the summer of 1937. Chief Engineer Jiro Horikoshi stared at the document laid out before him on the drafting table. It was the Imperial Japanese Navy's 12-SHI specification for a new carrier-based fighter aircraft. The numbers written on that paper defied the established laws of aeronautical physics of the era. The Navy demanded a maximum speed exceeding 500 kilometers per hour at an altitude of 4,000 meters. They required a climb rate that could reach 3,000 meters in exactly 3 minutes and 30 seconds. They wanted a combat radius of nearly 2,000 kilometers with the use of external drop tanks. And they demanded an armament package consisting of 2 heavy 20mm cannons and 2 7.7mm machine guns. This list of requirements was staggering on its own. But the true nightmare for Horikoshi was the power plant he was forced to use. American and European aerospace engineers building fighters with similar performance metrics were already utilizing massive inline or radial engines that generated well over 1,000 horsepower. Horikoshi had to achieve these miraculous numbers using a lightweight radial engine, initially the Mitsubishi Zuisei, later replaced by the Nakajima Sakai in production models. The Sakai produced a mere 940 horsepower. He was being asked to build an airplane that possessed the speed of a bullet, the range of a heavy bomber, and the acrobatic agility of a swallow. And he had to do it all with an engine that belonged in a standard trainer aircraft. Mathematics is a cruel and unforgiving master. To meet the speed and range requirements with such an underpowered engine, there was only one variable left in the equation to manipulate: weight. Horikoshi had to eliminate weight with a fanaticism bordering on absolute obsession. He turned to Sumitomo Metals, a company that had just developed a top-secret zinc and aluminum alloy called Extra Super Duralumin. This new alloy was incredibly strong but notoriously brittle. It allowed the Mitsubishi engineering team to design structural frames and exterior skin that were terrifyingly thin. You could literally push your thumb into the fuselage of the aircraft and feel the metal bend under your skin. But changing the metallurgical composition of the aircraft was simply not enough to satisfy the mathematics of the 12-SHI specification. The engineering team had to look at the human being sitting in the cockpit not as a precious tactical asset, but as just another mechanical component where heavy weight could be saved. There would be no armor plate behind the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no armored windshield. Every ounce of defensive capability was stripped away in the name of aerodynamic efficiency. This engineering decision was not made in a vacuum. It was not a desperate oversight. It aligned perfectly with the fundamental doctrinal philosophy of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Japanese military establishment viewed defensive measures as a manifestation of cowardice and spiritual weakness. Their tactical doctrine dictated that the best defense was an overwhelming and inescapable offense. A pilot of the Emperor did not need heavy steel armor, because a pilot of the Emperor would never allow an enemy aircraft to maneuver behind him in the first place. This is not a story about individual courage or the romance of aerial combat. This is a forensic audit of an aerodynamic masterpiece that was fundamentally flawed from the moment the first line was drawn on the drafting board. It is an investigation into how a mathematical equation designed to conquer the Pacific Ocean ultimately became a systematic death sentence for an entire generation of elite aviators. The aircraft that would soon be known to the world as the Mitsubishi A6M0 was a marvel of aerospace engineering. But it was also a flying coffin made of paper-thin aluminum and unprotected aviation fuel, simply waiting for a single stray spark. Before the Americans ever fired a shot in anger, the Imperial Japanese Navy had already doomed its finest men to the bottom of the ocean. The men destined to fly this new machine were not standard conscripts, and they were not easily replaced. The Okuren training program was one of the most brutal and highly selective military aviation schools in human history. Out of thousands of eager young applicants, only a tiny handful survived the grueling physical beatings and psychological abuse to finally earn their pilot wings. It took years of rigorous instruction, thousands of hours of flight time, and immense logistical resources to mold a Japanese farm boy into an apex predator of the sky. The Imperial Navy was investing an astronomical amount of time and money to create the ultimate human weapon. Yet, in a baffling display of institutional cognitive dissonance, they were placing that priceless human weapon inside an aluminum shell that offered less physical protection than a civilian automobile. The internal geometry of the Zero was essentially a massive flying fuel tank. To achieve its legendary combat range, fuel cells were crammed into every available empty cavity of the wings and the central fuselage. Hundreds of liters of highly volatile aviation gasoline were positioned mere inches from the pilot's unprotected back and legs. Without the self-sealing rubber technology that American and British engineers were already beginning to mandate in their own designs, a single bullet puncturing the thin metal skin would cause high-octane fuel to instantly vaporize inside the enclosed cockpit. A single incendiary round, or even a stray electrical spark from the struggling engine, would turn that unseen vapor into a catastrophic explosive inferno in a fraction of a second. Horikoshi and the highest ranks of the Navy brass knew this physical reality perfectly well, but they accepted the deadly trade-off because the mathematics of the 12 specification dictated it. They possessed an arrogant belief that superior maneuverability was the ultimate impenetrable armor. The fatal assumption was simple. If your aircraft can turn tighter and climb faster than any other machine on Earth, you will simply never be hit. It was a military philosophy built entirely on the assumption of permanent operational perfection. It assumed that the Japanese fighter pilot would never be tired, never be distracted, never be outnumbered, never be surprised by a cloud, and never make a single tactical mistake. But war is not a sterile drafting room. War is the ultimate realm of friction, chaos, and bloody error. When the first production models of the Zero rolled out of the factory doors, it was a sleek, deadly, and breathtakingly beautiful machine. It was about to unleash a wave of absolute terror upon the Allied air forces across the entire Pacific theater. For the first year of the global conflict, the fatal mathematics of the Mitsubishi design room would remain safely hidden behind a dense veil of spectacular military victories. The men sitting in those unarmored cockpits would feel completely invincible. They had absolutely no idea that they were flying a masterpiece of engineering that considered their own lives to be mathematically irrelevant. The eruption of the Pacific War in December 1941 validated every single assumption held by the Japanese Naval Command. Over the burning wreckage of Pearl Harbor and the skies of the Philippines, the Mitsubishi A6M-0 was unleashed as an absolute apex predator. It moved with a terrifying grace that defied the expectations of Allied intelligence. When American and British pilots first engaged the Zero in combat, they were flying machines like the Brewster F-2A Buffalo and the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. These Allied aircraft were rugged and heavily built, but in the eyes of the Japanese aviators, they were nothing more than cumbersome flying bricks. The Zero could climb at angles that would stall an American fighter and turn inside the turning radius of any opponent with effortless precision. The kill ratios achieved in those early months were catastrophic for the Allies. A terrifying psychological paralysis gripped American and British fighter squadrons. Rumors spread that the Japanese had engineered a superplane flown by supermen, but this overwhelming early success was hiding a massive statistical anomaly. The men flying the Zero during the opening phases of the war were not average pilots, they were the absolute elite of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Many of them had already accumulated hundreds of combat hours flying over the battlefields of China. They possessed an almost supernatural mastery of their machines. This immense reservoir of individual skill created a fatal optical illusion for the Japanese military establishment. The High Command looked at the astonishing kill counts and concluded that their radical engineering philosophy was flawless. They believed the lack of armor and the explosive fuel tanks were entirely justified because the enemy simply could not land a shot. The veteran pilots themselves shared this supreme arrogance. They executed maneuvers that bordered on the impossible, dancing through incoming tracer fire with contemptuous ease. Because they never got hit, they never had to face the mathematical reality of what happens when extra super duralumin meets armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. They were operating under a temporary umbrella of luck and unmatched proficiency. They did not realize that their invincibility was entirely dependent on their enemies remaining inexperienced and tactically rigid. Every time a Japanese pilot pulled off a miraculous vertical stall to slip behind an American fighter, he was reinforcing a catastrophic institutional lie. He was proving that a human being could temporarily cheat physics. But you cannot build a long-term industrial war strategy on the assumption that your soldiers will never make a mistake. In the brutal arithmetic of a protracted global conflict, the law of averages is absolute. Eventually, every fighter aircraft, no matter how agile, will find itself in the crosshairs of an enemy gun. Eventually, a pilot will be blinded by the sun, distracted by a radio call, or simply exhausted after a 4-hour combat patrol. When that inevitable moment occurred for an American pilot in a heavily armored P-40, he might limp home with a shredded wing and a shattered canopy. He would live to fight another day, carrying the priceless lessons of survival back to his squadron. But when that inevitable moment occurred for a Japanese pilot in a Zero, there were no second chances. There was no thick steel plate to absorb the kinetic energy of a .50 caliber bullet. There was no self-sealing rubber to choke off the flow of leaking aviation fuel. A single microsecond of bad luck or tactical error was punished by instant, fiery death. The Japanese military had effectively placed their most valuable and irreplaceable human assets on a tightrope suspended over a volcano. As long as the pilots executed every step with absolute perfection, the Empire would continue to conquer. But the moment they stumbled, the fall would be final. The air war over the Pacific in early 1942 was not a contest of equals. It was a slaughter. From the jungles of Malaya to the skies over Darwin, the A6M Zero operated with complete impunity. When a formation of Zeros dropped out of the sun, Allied pilots knew that engaging them in a traditional turning fight was an act of suicide. The Japanese aircraft seemed to defy gravity, hanging on its propeller in maneuvers that left American and British pilots staring in disbelief. The veteran Japanese aviators developed a distinct combat signature. They fought with a ruthless elegance. They knew their aircraft was an extension of their own nervous system. They could feel the exact moment the thin wings were about to stall, riding the ragged edge of aerodynamics with supreme confidence. They viewed the war as a glorious arena where their individual martial spirit could shine. This was the pure manifestation of the militarist ideology that the Imperial Navy had cultivated since the Meiji era. The pilot was the samurai, and the Zero was his flawlessly crafted katana, but a katana, for all its razor-sharp perfection, cannot act as a shield. The Japanese High Command systematically ignored the few warning signs that began to emerge during this period of absolute dominance. During the brutal air battles over Guadalcanal in the second half of 1942, several highly experienced Japanese pilots were lost in engagements against American Grumman F-4F Wildcats. The Wildcat was slower, heavier, and less maneuverable than the Zero, but it was built like a flying tank. When a Japanese pilot fired his 20mm cannons and missed, the American pilot could often absorb a few stray machine gun rounds and continue flying. When the American pilot returned fire with his battery of .50 caliber heavy machine guns, the results were entirely different. If even a short burst of American fire connected with the fuselage of a Zero, the Japanese aircraft did not merely sustain damage, it violently disintegrated. The extra super duralumin skin would tear open like wet paper under the impact of the heavy American projectiles. The unpressurized, unprotected fuel tanks located in the wing roots would instantly rupture. The resulting explosion would obliterate the aircraft, leaving nothing but a falling cloud of burning debris. Yet, the Imperial Japanese Navy refused to acknowledge this fundamental structural vulnerability as a systemic crisis. They dismissed the losses as isolated incidents or the result of individual pilot error. They doubled down on their core doctrine. They instructed their pilots to simply fly better, to attack more aggressively, and to never allow the enemy a firing solution. This institutional stubbornness created a deadly feedback loop. The more successful the Zero appeared on paper, the more the Japanese leadership believed in their flawed equation. They refused to allocate industrial resources to develop heavier, armored fighter aircraft. They were perfectly content to mass-produce the Zero, convinced that its agility would remain the ultimate trump card for the duration of the war. This was the peak of the illusion. The Japanese Empire was standing at the zenith of its military power, entirely unaware that the foundation of its aerial supremacy was hollow. They had built an air force optimized for a short, glorious war of rapid conquest. They had not built an air force capable of surviving a brutal, grinding war of industrial attrition against the United States. The veteran pilots who had terrorized the Pacific were living on borrowed time. Every mission they flew, every dogfight they entered, brought them one statistical step closer to the inevitable bullet that their aircraft could not absorb. And behind them, the Japanese training pipeline was utterly unprepared to replace them. The Yokoren program was designed to produce a handful of elite warriors, not an army of competent replacements. The Navy was treating its pilots like irreplaceable works of art, while simultaneously strapping them into explosive death traps. It was a paradox of lethal proportions. While the Japanese celebrated their invincible pilots, American intelligence officers were desperately compiling combat reports. They were trying to pierce the fog of war and find the mathematical weakness in the enemy's design. They noticed the alarming tendency of the Zero to catch fire when hit, but without a physical specimen to examine, they could only guess at the specific engineering choices that caused it. They needed proof. They needed to see the blueprint of the enemy's mind, and they were about to get it, delivered entirely by accident to a muddy, freezing island in the North Pacific. The turning point of the Pacific Air War did not happen in the skies over a massive fleet engagement. It happened in the freezing, desolate mud of a remote Alaskan island. In June 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched Operation AL. This was a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands designed to pull the American Pacific Fleet away from the primary target at Midway. During a raid on Dutch Harbor, a 19-year-old flight petty officer named Tadayoshi Koga was flying an A6M2 Model 21-0. As Koga strafed the American installations, his aircraft was hit by small arms fire from the ground. It was not a catastrophic hit. However, a single bullet severed the return oil line of his Nakajima Sakai engine. With his oil pressure dropping rapidly, Koga knew his engine would soon seize. He radioed his flight commander and announced his intention to make an emergency landing on a designated rally point on Akutan Island. From the air, the valley floor of Akutan looked like a solid, flat, grassy plain. It was a fatal optical illusion. The ground was actually a deep, waterlogged tundra bog. When Koga lowered his landing gear and touched down, the wheels immediately sank deep into the thick mud. The aircraft violently flipped onto its back. Tadayoshi Koga's neck was snapped by the impact, killing him instantly, but his aircraft, the most feared and mysterious fighter plane on the planet, remained almost completely intact. Koga's wingmen, following strict standing orders, were supposed to destroy any downed Zero to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. But they could not bring themselves to strafe the wreckage, uncertain if Koga might still be alive inside the upside-down cockpit. That moment of human hesitation was one of the most disastrous intelligence failures in the history of the Japanese Empire. 5 weeks later, an American PBY Catalina flying boat on a routine patrol spotted the wreckage sitting in the bog. An American recovery team was immediately dispatched to the island. They dragged the pristine Zero out of the mud, loaded it onto a barge, and shipped it under heavy guard to the Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, California. What happened next was not a military operation, but a comprehensive forensic autopsy. American aerospace engineers and naval intelligence officers completely dismantled the legendary machine. They were expecting to find some kind of miraculous alien technology. They were expecting to find an aerodynamic secret that would explain how this aircraft had systematically destroyed the Allied air forces across the Pacific. Instead, what they found left them in a state of profound shock and professional disbelief. As they peeled back the extra super duralumin skin, the terrible truth of the Japanese design philosophy was laid bare. The engineers meticulously searched for the heavy steel armor plate that was standard in all American and European fighter aircraft. They found absolutely nothing. There was no armor behind the pilot's seat to protect his spine. There was no armored glass in the canopy to protect his face. They opened the wings to inspect the fuel system, expecting to find the heavy self-sealing rubber bladders that prevented leaks and fires. Again, they found nothing. The aviation fuel was held in bare, unpressurized metal tanks integrated directly into the structural frame of the wings. The American engineers realized that the invincibility of the Zero was not based on technological superiority. It was based on a ruthless, almost sociopathic mathematical calculation. The Japanese had achieved their miraculous speed, range, and maneuverability by completely erasing the survival profile of the pilot. They had built a machine that was aerodynamically brilliant but structurally disposable. The engineers compiled a detailed forensic report that fundamentally changed the Allied understanding of the enemy. They concluded that the Zero was a flying tinderbox. A single incendiary round from a .50 caliber machine gun would easily pierce the thin duralumin skin, shatter the unprotected fuel tank, and instantly ignite the highly volatile aviation gasoline. But the autopsy did not stop at structural analysis. The Americans repaired the Akutan Zero and put it in the air. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders, an experienced test pilot, flew 24 test flights in the captured machine against American fighter aircraft. He pushed the Zero to its absolute limits to map its exact flight envelope. Sanders discovered several critical aerodynamic flaws that the Japanese had carefully hidden. First, he realized that the Zero's ailerons became incredibly stiff at high speeds. If an American pilot pushed his aircraft into a dive exceeding 250 miles per hour, the Japanese pilot simply could not physically move the control stick to follow a rolling maneuver. Second, the Nakajima Sakai engine utilized a standard float-type carburetor instead of a pressure carburetor. This meant that if the Zero was forced into a sudden negative G maneuver, such as abruptly nosing down into a steep dive, the engine would temporarily starve for fuel and sputter. This engine stutter only lasted for a fraction of a second, but in aerial combat, a fraction of a second is the difference between life and death. These engineering discoveries were immediately translated into a brutal new tactical doctrine. The intelligence was broadcast to every Allied fighter squadron operating in the Pacific Theater. The days of American pilots attempting to match the turning radius of the Zero were over. The new standing orders were absolute and unforgiving. Never attempt to dogfight a Zero. Do not engage them in a turning battle. Instead, utilize the boom and zoom tactic. American pilots were instructed to use their heavier aircraft to gain an altitude advantage. They were told to dive on the enemy at maximum speed, fire a concentrated burst of heavy machine gun fire, and then use their kinetic energy to climb back up or escape. If they missed their initial pass, they were ordered to simply fly away. The American military apparatus had successfully decoded the fatal arithmetic of the Japanese design. They understood that they did not need to outturn the enemy. They only needed to land a single, well-placed shot. The Akutan autopsy transformed the Zero from a mythical monster into a fragile mathematical equation, and the American industrial machine was already preparing to solve that equation with an overwhelming application of heavy steel and incendiary lead. The intelligence gathered from the Akutan bog did not simply sit in a filing cabinet in Washington. It was weaponized almost immediately, reinforcing a tactical revolution that had already begun. Even before the Akutan discovery, Lieutenant Commander John S. Thack had been analyzing intelligence reports about the Zero coming out of China. Thach understood that if an American pilot tried to fight a Japanese pilot in a traditional one-on-one turning engagement, the American would die. The extreme mathematics of the Zero's maneuverability made a solo dogfight a guaranteed death sentence, so Thach removed the concept of the solo duel entirely. Working at his kitchen table with matchsticks as makeshift aircraft, he developed an intersecting flight pattern that would become known to history as the Thach weave. He first tested it in combat at the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, the very same month Coffin Zero crashed in Alaska. It was a brilliantly simple application of geometric mutually supporting crossfire. Instead of flying independently, American fighters operated in tightly coordinated pairs. When a Zero latched onto the tail of an American plane, that pilot did not try to outturn the pursuing Japanese fighter. Instead, he flew in a predictable, shallow turn, effectively acting as human bait. His wingman would then turn sharply towards him, crossing his flight path. As the two American planes intersected, the wingman would have a brief, devastating window to fire a head-on or side deflection shot at the pursuing Zero. The Japanese pilots, trained to excel in individual, honorable combat, suddenly found themselves trapped in a mathematically calculated kill zone. When a Japanese ace, accustomed to effortlessly tracking his terrified prey through a tight turn, suddenly found a massive American fighter screaming toward him head-on with heavy machine guns blazing, the psychological shock was paralyzing. The invincible hunter was instantly transformed into the hunted, but this tactical innovation was merely a stopgap measure. The true American counterattack was not going to be fought on a chalkboard or entirely through tactical radio discipline. It was going to be forged in the massive factories of the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, New York. If the Mitsubishi Zero was a razor-sharp but incredibly fragile katana, the machine Grumman was building was a flying sledgehammer. It was designated the F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was not designed as an abstract aerodynamic exercise in graceful flight. It was explicitly engineered from the ground up to be the ultimate, uncompromising Zero killer. Leroy Grumman, Leon Swerbel, and their engineering team had rigorously analyzed the grim combat reports flowing back from the Pacific. They knew exactly what the Japanese fighters could do, and more importantly, thanks to the Akutan autopsy, they knew exactly what the Japanese aircraft lacked. The American engineers took a path that was diametrically opposed to Jiro Horikoshi's extreme weight reduction philosophy. They embraced weight. They embraced massive structural mass. They utilized the monstrous Pratt & Whitney R2T800 double-wasp radial engine, a mechanical beast consisting of 18 heavily finned cylinders capable of generating over 2,000 horsepower. This was more than double the power output of the Zero's lightweight Sakai engine. This massive surplus of brute mechanical power allowed Grumman to build an aircraft that prioritized pilot survival and heavy firepower above all other metrics. Inside the cockpit of a Hellcat, an American pilot was surrounded by 212 pounds of thick steel armor plating. His head, neck, and upper spine were protected by a massive slab of solid steel directly behind the pilot seat. His face was shielded by a windshield made of 1.5-inch thick bullet-resistant glass that could casually deflect a direct hit from a standard machine gun. And most crucially, the massive internal fuel tanks of the Hellcat were wrapped in thick, heavy layers of self-sealing rubber. This rubber compound was a chemical and logistical marvel. If a Japanese 20mm explosive shell managed to penetrate the outer aluminum skin and strike a fuel tank, the raw rubber lining would instantly react with the seeping aviation fuel. It would swell up and organically seal the bullet hole within a matter of seconds. This brilliant mechanism prevented the highly volatile, high-octane gasoline from leaking into the hot fuselage and igniting into a catastrophic fireball. The Hellcat was heavy, physically imposing, and entirely unapologetic about its rugged bulk. It was affectionately known by the men who flew it as the aluminum tank, or simply the ironworks. It was designed under a completely different set of moral, economic, and logistical parameters than the Japanese Zero. The American military-industrial complex viewed a trained fighter pilot as an incredibly valuable, nearly irreplaceable strategic asset. The logic driving this design was brutally practical. An aluminum airplane, no matter how technologically complex, could be stamped out of an automated assembly line in a matter of days. But a skilled, combat-ready aviator took years of expensive training, hundreds of hours of carefully monitored flight time, and a massive logistical support network to produce. Therefore, the machine had to be sacrificed to save the man. If an F-6F Hellcat returned to a carrier deck with 200 bullet holes stitched across its fuselage, a shattered canopy, a shredded rudder, and a smoking engine, it was considered a highly successful design. The machine had absorbed the lethal punishment, allowing the pilot to walk away, debrief the intelligence officers, share his hard-won combat experience with the new rookies, and climb into a brand new airplane the very next morning. This philosophy of extreme survivability fundamentally transformed the entire psychology of the American fighter pilot. When an American aviator strapped into a Hellcat, he knew he was sitting inside a flying vault. He did not have to fly with absolute, flawless perfection to survive a combat mission. He could afford to make a mistake. He could misjudge a maneuver, get jumped from behind by a hidden enemy, take a devastating burst of machine gun fire to the wing root, and still have a mathematically high probability of returning home alive. This psychological safety net allowed American pilots to fight with a terrifying, overwhelming level of aggression. They knew they could take a punch and keep flying. The Japanese pilots, still strapped into their unprotected, fragile aluminum shells, were completely unprepared for an enemy that simply refused to burn. The Japanese had built their entire aerial combat doctrine around the arrogant assumption that a single solid hit would destroy any enemy aircraft. They were about to discover that their weapons were entirely insufficient against American industrial armor. The armament of the Hellcat was just as brutal as its defensive plating. It carried 650 caliber M2 Browning heavy machine guns, each supplied with 400 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. This battery created a dense, unbroken wall of kinetic energy that could physically saw a fragile Zero in half in less than 2 seconds of sustained fire. The Zero, in stark contrast, relied on 2 low-velocity 20mm cannons that carried very little ammunition, paired with 2 rifle-caliber machine guns that simply bounced off American armor plates. The mathematical equation of the Pacific sky had been completely rewritten. The stage was now perfectly set for a catastrophic collision of these two opposing philosophies. The illusion of Japanese invincibility was about to be shattered by a wall of armored steel, a massive radial engine, and the relentless logic of industrial warfare. The ultimate collision between the mathematics of agility and the mathematics of industrial armor occurred in the skies over the Mariana Islands in June 1944. The Imperial Japanese Navy launched Operation A-Go. It was a desperate, massive counterattack designed to destroy the American Fifth Fleet and halt the relentless Allied advance across the Central Pacific. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa committed the bulk of his remaining carrier forces to this decisive battle. This armada included hundreds of A6M Zeros, launching from the flight decks of legendary carriers like the Taiho, the Shokaku, the Zuikaku, and the Hio. The Taiho and Shokaku would be sunk by American submarines during the battle itself, while the Hio would fall to American carrier aircraft. But the Japanese aviators sitting in those unarmored cockpits were no longer the seasoned, untouchable veterans who had bombed Pearl Harbor and terrorized the skies over the Philippines. Most of that elite, irreplaceable vanguard had already perished in the grinding, merciless attrition of Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Solomon Islands. They had been killed not because they lacked skill, but because their fragile aircraft offered them zero margin for error. The men taking their place over the Philippine Sea were young, hastily trained recruits. They were boys who possessed only a fraction of the flying hours and practical combat experience of their predecessors. Yet they were still strapped into the exact same fragile aluminum shells. They were flying into a modern, industrialized battle space, carrying the heavy, deadly burden of a flawed doctrine that they did not fully comprehend. They still believed in the myth of the Zero. They still believed that their spiritual purity and the Emperor's blessing could somehow compensate for a total lack of physical protection. As the massive Japanese strike packages approached Task Force 58, they were not met by a surprised or technologically inferior enemy. They were met by an impenetrable, invisible wall of early warning radar. American combat information centers aboard the carriers tracked the incoming swarms while they were still 100 miles away. The element of surprise, which had been the crucial component of early Japanese victories, was completely erased. Fighter directors vectored massive swarms of Grumman F-6F Hellcats directly into the path of the incoming Japanese formations. The ensuing engagement would become known to American aviators as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But from the perspective of the Japanese pilots, it was not a hunt. It was an inexplicable, terrifying massacre that defied everything they had been taught in their flight schools. When a Japanese pilot managed to slip through the dense defensive screens and line up a textbook deflection shot on an American Hellcat, he expected the same devastating results his instructors had spoken of. He pressed the firing trigger, sending a stream of 7.7mm machine gun fire and a burst of 20mm high-explosive shells toward the heavy blue fighter. The shells struck home, but the Hellcat merely shuddered, trailed a puff of grey smoke, and kept flying with terrifying stability. The Japanese pilot stared through his unarmored, curved canopy in a state of absolute cognitive shock. He had executed the maneuver flawlessly. He had achieved a perfect firing solution. According to every principle of the Imperial Navy's combat doctrine, that American plane should have violently disintegrated in mid-air. But the massive enemy machine simply refused to die. Before the Japanese pilot could properly process this terrifying violation of aerodynamic logic, the American pilot reacted. The Hellcat did not attempt to engage in a graceful, turning dance that would favor the Zero's lightweight design. Instead, the American utilized his massive 2,000 horsepower double Wasp engine to power through a high-speed, energy-retaining maneuver. He simply brought the massive nose of his aircraft around, placing the fragile Zero in his glowing gun sight, and then he unleashed his battery of 650 caliber heavy machine guns. The difference in terminal ballistics was horrific, absolute, and deeply unforgiving. When the concentrated stream of American armor-piercing incendiary rounds struck the fragile wing root of the Japanese fighter, it did not just punch neat aerodynamic holes in the metal. The heavy, high-velocity projectiles physically shattered the thin extra super duralumin spars. They instantly penetrated the completely unarmored aviation fuel tanks hidden within the wings. Because there was no thick layer of self-sealing rubber to choke off the breach, the highly volatile, high-octane vapor violently mixed with the incendiary sparks of the incoming American tracers. In less than a fraction of a second, the Japanese fighter was consumed by a massive, blinding fireball. The aircraft simply ceased to exist as a controllable flying machine. It was instantly reduced to a tumbling, burning comet of shattered metal and screaming flesh falling toward the cold ocean surface. The surviving Japanese pilots witnessed their comrades vanishing into fiery explosions all around them. A profound psychological paralysis gripped the attacking formations. The radio frequencies were filled with the panicked, final screams of young men burning alive in the sky. They realized, with sudden terrifying clarity, that their individual bravery was mathematically irrelevant. They were trapped in flying coffins, fighting against armored vaults that could spit a localized hurricane of flaming lead. The American pilots, shielded safely behind their bullet-resistant glass and heavy steel plates, flew with a relaxed, almost mechanical efficiency. They trusted their machines to absorb the inevitable mistakes of combat. They utilized the thack weave and disciplined flight tactics to cover each other's blind spots, dragging any pursuing Zeros into a lethal, inescapable crossfire. The battle was a cold, brutal, forensic demonstration of the ultimate failure of the Japanese design philosophy. It was the physical manifestation of what happens when a military system values performance metrics over human life. Over the course of 2 devastating days in June, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost over 400 aircraft and the vast majority of their newly trained aircrews. The sky above the Philippine Sea was literally painted with the falling, burning wreckage of an entire generation of naval aviators. It was the complete and final collapse of the illusion that offensive agility could somehow negate the sheer industrial necessity of physical armor. The Japanese military establishment had bet the survival of their empire on a fragile mathematical equation written in a Nagoya design room scene 7 years earlier. And in the skies over the Marianas, the American industrial machine brutally, systematically, and permanently solved that equation with fire and heavy steel. The loss of 400 aircraft in a single engagement was a catastrophic material blow to the Japanese empire, but in the cold mathematical ledger of industrial warfare, airplanes are merely riveted aluminum. They are consumable items that can be stamped out of a factory floor by the thousands. The true irreversible catastrophe of the Marianas and of the entire zero design philosophy lay in the cockpit. It was the loss of the human beings operating the machines. This is where the forensic audit of the Imperial Japanese Navy reveals its most fatal systemic failure. They did not understand the logistics of human capital. To understand why the Japanese air forces collapsed so completely, one must look away from the blazing dogfights and examine the quiet, relentless arithmetic of the training pipelines. The United States operated its pilot training program as a massive, self-replicating industrial engine. When an American pilot achieved A status and survived a grueling combat tour, the American military apparatus did something the Japanese found entirely baffling. They took their best killers off the front lines. They ordered their most lethal and experienced combat veterans back to the safety of the United States. These seasoned aces were not sent home to rest or merely to sell war bonds. They were placed directly into the Naval Air Training Command to become instructors. They were tasked with standing in front of chalkboards at Pensacola or Corpus Christi, pouring their hard-won, bloody combat experience into the minds of thousands of raw, eager recruits. They taught the new generation exactly how to execute the THAC weave with mathematical precision. They taught them the exact visual cues that signaled a zero was about to stall. They taught them the precise mechanical weaknesses of the enemy's unarmored fuel system. They taught them how to survive. This system ensured that the institutional knowledge of the American military was constantly compounding, growing exponentially with every passing month. An American rookie arriving in the Pacific in 1944 might have never seen combat, but he had already flown over 300 training hours. He had practiced advanced deflection, shooting against moving targets dragged by other aircraft. He was technically a rookie, but he possessed the tactical wisdom of a veteran before he ever fired a shot in anger. The Japanese system operated on the exact opposite logic, driven by a fatal misinterpretation of warrior ethos. The Imperial Navy viewed combat experience as an individual spiritual virtue, not as an industrial asset to be shared and multiplied. When a Japanese pilot proved himself to be an exceptional ace, he was not sent home to train the next generation. He was kept on the bleeding edge of the front lines. He was ordered to fly mission after mission, day after day, month after month, with virtually no rotation system in place. He was expected to fight for the Emperor until he was either physically broken by malaria and combat fatigue or permanently extinguished by enemy fire. And because that irreplaceable ace was strapped into an A6M0, a machine completely devoid of protective armor, his eventual death was a mathematical certainty. It was only a matter of time before exhaustion, a minor mechanical failure, or a single lucky .50 caliber bullet found its mark. When that veteran pilot died in a sudden fireball over the Solomon Islands or the Bismarck Sea, he took all of his invaluable combat experience to the bottom of the ocean with him. He could not pass his spatial awareness or his tactical genius onto a classroom of cadets. His hard-earned expertise was permanently deleted from the Japanese military matrix. This relentless bleeding attrition created a catastrophic vacuum within the Japanese logistical pipeline. Before the war, the elite Yokarin program required hundreds of hours of intense flight time and years of rigorous psychological selection to produce a single naval aviator, with the best pilots accumulating well over 500 flight hours before ever seeing combat. It was a bespoke, artisanal process designed to craft a master warrior, but by late 1944, that luxurious, time-consuming timeline had completely collapsed under the crushing weight of American industrial output. The veteran instructors were all dead. The aviation fuel required for extensive training flights had been severely choked off by the silent, lethal blockade of American submarines. The Japanese High Command, desperate to plug the gaping holes in their shattered squadrons, was forced to strip the training schools bare. They began hurling half-trained adolescents into the industrial meat grinder of the Pacific. The young men climbing into the cockpits of the newly manufactured Zeros were often just 18 or 19 years old. Many of them had less than 100 total hours of flight time in their entire lives. They had barely learned how to navigate a flight pattern or land a high-performance aircraft on a pitching carrier deck without crashing. They had virtually no live fire training in aerial gunnery, deflection shooting, or advanced combat maneuvers. They were not the apex predators who had devastated Pearl Harbor. They were sacrificial lambs dressed in oversized flight suits, and they were being strapped into the exact same unforgiving, unarmored aircraft that had demanded absolute, flawless perfection from the seasoned veterans. If a master aviator with 3,000 flight hours could not survive a single tactical mistake in a Zero, what mathematical chance did a terrified teenager have? The answer was written in the horrifying casualty ratios of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. The American pilots realized they were no longer fighting the mythical samurai of the sky. They were shooting down frightened boys who flew in straight lines, panicked under tracer fire, and frequently forgot basic procedures, like dropping their highly flammable external fuel tanks before engaging in combat. The A6M0, which had once been a terrifying instrument of surgical precision, was now just a mass-produced aluminum coffin waiting to be ignited by American incendiary rounds. The flawed blueprint drafted by Jiro Horikoshi and the Naval High Command in 1937 had finally reached its inevitable, grim conclusion. By sacrificing defensive armor and self-sealing fuel tanks for offensive agility, they had built an aircraft that murdered its own pilots at a rate that the Empire simply could not sustain. They had optimized their entire military aviation branch for the first 6 months of a war, utterly neglecting the logistical endurance required for the next 3 years. The United States had essentially weaponized the concept of pilot survivability. By building heavy armored fighters like the Hellcat and the Corsair, they mathematically guaranteed that their pilots would live long enough to learn from their mistakes. By building fragile, highly flammable fighters, the Japanese mathematically guaranteed that their pilots would die the very first time they made one. It was a brutal, objective demonstration of the supreme law of modern conflict. Industrial warfare is not a test of individual heroism or spiritual purity. It is a supreme test of systemic resilience and logistical depth, and the Japanese system, rotting from the inside out due to its own flawed aerodynamic philosophy, had finally broken beyond repair. The forensic audit of the Mitsubishi A6M0 leaves no room for romantic interpretation. It presents a cold and terrifying balance sheet of industrial warfare. On one side of the ledger, you have an aerodynamic masterpiece capable of unparalleled agility and devastating early strike capability. On the other side, you have a catastrophic human attrition rate that systematically erased an entire generation of elite aviators. By 1945, the average American replacement pilot entered combat with nearly 400 hours of rigorous flight training. The average Japanese replacement pilot was sent into the sky with barely 100 hours, and sometimes much less. The American pilot was strapped into a flying fortress protected by heavy steel, bullet-resistant glass, and self-sealing rubber. The Japanese pilot was still strapped into a fragile aluminum shell wrapped around unpressurized aviation fuel. The verdict is absolute. The Zero did not fail because it was a poorly engineered aircraft. It failed because it was the perfect physical manifestation of a fundamentally flawed military doctrine. It was a machine designed by a system that viewed human beings as expendable ammunition rather than irreplaceable capital. The Imperial Japanese Navy believed that spiritual purity and offensive aggression could overcome the fundamental laws of physics and the brutal arithmetic of industrial production. They were wrong. When you strip away the propaganda and the myths of the samurai, modern warfare is not a contest of individual bravery, it is a supreme test of systemic endurance. The system that prioritized the survival of its people ultimately crushed the system that demanded their absolute sacrifice. Today, the rusting skeletons of hundreds of Zeros lie scattered across the muddy bottoms of the Pacific Ocean and buried deep in overgrown jungle ravines. They serve as silent, haunting monuments to the young men who were betrayed by the very blueprints drawn in their own homeland. They flew with unmatched skill, but they were doomed before their wheels ever left the runway. If you want to understand how wars are truly won and lost beneath the surface of the battlefield, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Because history is rarely decided by the sharpest sword, it is almost always decided by the side that knows how to protect the hands that hold it.